Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Martyn. I'm the Chief Executive of the Department for Energy and Mining in the South Australian Government. Thank you for coming and joining us tonight for this information session on the proposal to lift the ban on hydraulic fracturing in the southeast of the state. This forum arises out of a community meeting that was held in Mount Gambier last week, and a commitment was made to provide an opportunity to provide further information to the community about the regulatory assessment process. I do want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet here in Adelaide, but of course the lands on which across the state where you are as well. I want to introduce some partner regulators here tonight who will also be talking to you. So obviously I'm from Energy and Mining, but I'd like to introduce Ben Bruce, who's the Chief Executive of the Department of Environment and Water, and Amy Dennison, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Environment Protection Authority. So the three of us are going to present to you about the regulatory assessment process that is involved with hydraulic fracturing. We then want to move into questions because we know that you're online and we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. We think it's important that you can do that. What I would like to say is there are some questions that have been submitted in advance. I really appreciate that. We'll also be joined later by my colleague Dominic Pepicelli, who is the Principal Engineer in DEM, who'll be helping to facilitate those questions. So we have some questions that have already been asked. Thank you. We'll address those. You're also welcome to submit your questions throughout the session using the Q&A function on your screen. However, we may get a lot of questions, and what I want to say to you is we will answer every single question. So if we don't get through your question tonight, can you please just put your name in with your question so we can follow you up afterwards? Because we just want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity. So thank you again for taking time out of your night. There was a very large, as I say, community meeting last week in Mount Gambier, and we got the sense that there was a hunger in the community just to know some factual details. So I'm just going to kick off my presentation. I'll flick onto some slides now. Again, just there's some instructions there about submitting your questions. And if for whatever reason something goes wrong and you can't submit your question, do not fear. You can email it to our email, demengagement@sa.gov.au. So just a quick background. First thing to say is that Amy, Ben, myself and Dominic are public servants, and we're here to provide information from the perspective of public servants. We're not politicians, so we'll answer your regulatory questions, but of course, if you have questions you want to ask of politicians, there are other places and other ways to do that, and I hope you understand that tonight. Briefly though, so the South Australian Government has introduced legislation into Parliament to amend the Energy Resources Act 2000 and remove the current moratorium. Now, the moratorium remains in place unless and until Parliament passes that legislation. Now, the bill must be debated and passed by both houses of Parliament, and if passed, the change would remove the blanket ban only, and I will return to what that means, particularly in terms of the assessment process under the Energy Resources Act. The bill, and you can go online to the South Australian Parliament and have a look at it. It is very simple. It simply removes Section 11A of that Act. So that's just a little bit of background. So if I can begin by talking a bit about what's changed since 2018 when the moratorium came into place. So there's three things really. The first is there is stronger science around hydraulic stimulation. We know more than we did in 2018, and right around the country, more research has been undertaken to understand what hydraulic stimulation does, how it affects landscapes, aquifers, etc., and what that might mean. And, we've seen scientific research move from just theory to field practice. Here in South Australia, an extensive amount of research has been undertaken together with the CSIRO, and that information is publicly available. So there's stronger science to support the regulatory task, but also there is actually stronger regulation. In 2018, the Pepper inquiry was undertaken in the Northern Territory, a very detailed and extensive inquiry into hydraulic stimulation that ultimately concluded that it could be allowed, but only if there was strong and effective regulation. And what I would say is that when we reflect on the South Australian regulatory system, many lessons have been drawn from the Pepper inquiry. So we have made a number of changes. The first is around community consultation. And we will return to that a couple of points, but I know it's important based on my conversations with people in the Southeast. Mandatory community consultation has been introduced. Secondly, there are tighter compliance provisions. And thirdly, improved technical oversight by both by my department, the Department of Environment and Water that Ben represents, and the Environment Protection Authority that Amy represents. Plus, it's important to remember that the Commonwealth's Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act is likely to apply as well. So stronger science, stronger regulation, but also there is a changed energy outlook. And I'll comment using my energy hat. It is fair to say that our energy system in South Australia and more broadly across the country relies increasingly on gas to balance renewables. In South Australia, we have world-leading penetration of renewable energy at 75%, but the balance is provided by gas-fired generation. And that gas is going to be critical for our energy security going forward. The Australian Energy Market Operator has released the Gas Statement of Opportunities, which identifies that the country faces, or the East Coast market, faces potential gas shortfalls in 2030. And so clearly increased supplies of gas will be necessary. Australia has a lot of gas, but it tends to be in places, so a lot of the gas is in Queensland, but the pipeline capacity to get it, for example, to South Australia is not there. So the need for gas to balance our energy system and to improve our energy security has also emerged significantly since 2018. What I would like to talk to you now is about what the government's decision does and does not do. And this is really important for us to understand. What is important is the removal of the moratorium does not mean that fracking is allowed. It does not authorise any fracking activity or approve fracking. It does not remove any environmental protection, nor does it override your right to have a say. The removal of Section 11A simply removes a prohibition on the process and the consideration through the normal regulatory process of applications to do this. So what lifting the moratorium does allow companies to begin planning. Now, many people will know that gas has been explored in the southeast since the 90s. That's conventional gas exploration and drilling. But the companies would then begin, should they wish to do so, to plan for accessing tighter rock formulations using hydraulic stimulation. It enables companies to begin collecting baseline data. This is a very important part of the regulatory process, and we would expect that companies would have a minimum of 2 years of baseline data around aquifers, around soils, etc., to underpin any regulatory consideration. It maintains full government control over approvals. This is not by any means an environment in which activities can take place without strong regulation. And it keeps every existing safeguard in place. There is, and there will be, should the moratorium be lifted, an extensive regulatory process before any activity is considered. I want to talk to you a little bit more in more detail about what are the steps in that process. So this is a simple map which you'll be able to get on our website. So if you can't see it in detail, don't worry, but it will be available on our website. I just want to talk to you a little bit about the regulatory process, because this is important in terms of providing reassurance around the steps that are taken before hydraulic stimulation would be allowed. The first thing a proponent needs to have is an exploration licence. Now, this exploration licence does not in and of itself allow any regulatory activity. All it is says that a company is allowed to pursue activities through the system in a particular area. Now, once you have an exploration licence, the company has to do there are two critical processes that apply. The first is an environmental impact report, and the second is a statement of environmental objectives. Now, the EIR is a statutory process that requires the identification of risks. This is important. Examining, doing scientific studies in the area that's proposed for hydraulic stimulation. What are the risks to water, soils, cultural heritage, air, water, noise, etc.? So that's the risks, and they have to be thoroughly studied, and the results of those studies have to be released publicly. The statement of environmental objectives is how those risks will be addressed, if they can be. So the statement of environmental objectives is a document that goes through the risks and identifies management techniques, but also a regime of monitoring and reporting that would be required of proponents. What's really important is that the company must execute a consultation plan with the department, which talks to how they will consult the community and other stakeholders through the process of developing the EIR and the Statement of Environmental Objectives. So that is an ongoing consultation requirement. There is, in addition, a 30-day mandatory public consultation period that must occur on these documents. So you're engaged during the process, you get to see the reports that are prepared, there's a statutory consultation period, and that is what all that has to be taken into account. And we in the departments and our co-regulators look to see the community input has been accommodated in the process. So if the activity is allowed, and DEM will, if necessary, and our co-regulators will, if necessary, obtain our own scientific reports. We don't just simply rely on what the company says to us. The Minister will approve the Statement of Environmental Objectives. Now that document is gazetted. It is a semi-regulatory document that binds the company. So it's a very important document. It's a document in which the community and stakeholders have a say. So they have to have an environmental exploration licence. They have to consult extensively and do a wide range of work on the environmental impact report, the statement of environmental objectives. All that comes together, statutory consultation process, independent assessment, and approvals. The SEO becomes a regulatory document. There's a third level. Before any activity can take place on any landholder's land, there must be an activity notification prepared and submitted, which allows an activity-specific environmental measurement against the approved SEO. So again, just SEO is the conditions. It's based on the risk assessment, and then any activities that are sought to be undertaken on an individual's land must align with that SEO. Now, of course, every landholder will have to negotiate an access agreement with the company that involves compensation for any disturbance of the use of that land. We will only approve a notice of entry and a permission to allow activities on that land if we're satisfied that that agreement has been entered into and the concerns of the landholder have been addressed. And again, the landholder receives all the information they need in advance, and also the land entry issues have to be addressed. So 3 levels, consultation at each level. So to reiterate, your say is guaranteed at the level of the environmental impact report, at the level of the statement of environmental objectives, and in the site-specific approval. No is, at every stage, no is a real outcome. It is not a formality. We take this process very seriously. We want to make sure that mining is undertaken and gas exploration is undertaken in a sustainable and acceptable fashion. So, one of the issues that we know is important to people in the southeast are the aquifers. And I want to assure you that groundwater protection is the number one priority for any future assessment of hydraulic stimulation. It is non-negotiable. We will undertake independent hydrological assessments. So the company will have to do that, but we will as well, to ensure that the hydrology is well understood, that the impact on aquifers, if there is well understood. We also require that baseline monitoring that I talked about, so we understand that what is the existing condition of the water and enabling us to create a permanent public record. And of course, the Department for Environment and Water and the Environmental Protection Authority provide detailed advice and input, and they can talk to you more about that. So DEM is the lead regulator, together with our co-regulators, and you can see them listed there on the advice. One thing I want to say to you, and I said this to the community forum in Mount Gambier last week, DEM has been undertaking an extensive process of community engagement in the southeast to better understand community concerns. We understand that there are some unique environments and landscapes, some important industries and communities in that region. And I'd like to think that we have improved how we engage with the community, what we've learnt from that engagement, and hopefully we are better at it. But I will now hand over to my colleague, Ben, to talk to the role of the Department for Environment and Water. Thank you, Ben.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul, and good evening, everyone. So I'll just run through the role of the Department for Environment and Water in this process. So DEW participates in all aspects of the fracking regulatory framework administered by Department for Energy and Mining, including in relation to environmental impact reports and statements of environmental objectives. So we base all our assessments on the best available science and data, and we have a team of experts within our department that specialise in this area, are experienced in a range of jurisdictions, not just our own. In terms of water access and impacts, the onshore petroleum industry in South Australia also remains subject to the Landscape South Australia Act, which some people may know as the Natural Resources Management Act in previous iterations. So that act still applies, and we have to meet all the obligations required under that. If water is to be taken from a prescribed area, then a water licence is required, just like for every other user. So the industry is treated the same through that process. For other activities that could impact on the condition of water resources or other users, a water affecting activity permit may be required from the relevant landscape board. If accessing groundwater, a well construction permit will need to be secured from our department, and there's a rigorous assessment process around approving them. The department will work with DEM and the EPA to develop appropriate monitoring requirements if a project was to proceed. So all of that detail is taken into account, thoroughly evaluated as we go through. And DEW would also address any compliance and enforcement issues arising under the Landscape Act, again, if any project were to proceed. So there are a lot of layers that we assess these projects and make sure that we're protecting the aquifers and the water resources of whatever region we're dealing with. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Ben. I will now hand over to Amy Dennison from the EPA to talk about their role.
Thanks so much, Paul. So the EPA is South Australia's independent environmental regulator. And what that means in practice is that we administer the Environment Protection Act independently, which means without direction from ministers and from government when it comes to issuing licences and enforcing compliance with them. We are very much a science-led organisation. When we make decisions, we look to the data, we look to the evidence, we look to the advice from our water chemists, from our environmental scientists to inform the decisions that we make. And I think it's safe to say that having the environmental regulator in the form of the EPA having some oversight and involvement in the petroleum development ensures that there's a level of oversight and that there is processes in place that ensure the industry is being held to account. Now, the first stop point there, excuse me, makes it clear that the Environment Protection Act applies to onshore petroleum development. But it's not just the Act that applies, just building on Paul's comments before. There's also a series of subordinate legislation that sits underneath the Act. And the most important for onshore, upstream onshore petroleum development is arguably the Water Quality Environment Protection Policy. And that sets out the rules for how water, whether it be surface or groundwater, is protected in South Australia. And it's no secret to anyone online that the water in the southeast is of enormous value, not just in terms of its drinking water, but also in terms of the fact that lots of industries rely on it for economic development. And so, as Paul said, in relation not only to DEM approvals, but certainly to EPA approvals, nothing would ever be approved that was in any way contravening the water quality environment protection policy. The second point there is the point that separate environmental approvals from the EPA are required for production activities. Now, these approvals are over and above the approvals that Paul was talking about. The Environment Protection Act requires a separate environmental approval for all activities listed in Schedule A of the Environment Protection Act, and that includes things like hydrocarbon production, hydrocarbon storage, wastewater treatment, waste disposal. And again, we would always make sure that the requirements of the water quality environment protection policy were adhered to in issuing any approvals. So if you pull this framework together, just again building on what Paul was saying about how the system works, in order for any upstream onshore development to occur during the production phase, certainly, a lot of things would need to be true. First, you need your tenure in place. Second, you need the approved statement of environmental objectives and the EIR in place. Third, you need whatever approvals are required from Department of Environment, as Ben said. And finally, you need the separate environmental for all prescribed activities of environmental significance under the Environment Protection Act. The cumulative effect of all of those approvals provides certainty, certainly to the community, that this is a robust regime. And in addition to the separate environmental approvals I was talking about, as Paul alluded to earlier, the EPA reviews and provides comment on, alongside you, all of the statement of environmental objectives and environmental impact reports. So, and that applies whether it's in exploration or production. So our water chemists and environmental scientists are involved every step of the way. And just finally on that fourth point there, and I can't help myself because I am born and bred environmental regulator, the EPA takes contraventions of environmental licenses and the Environment Protection Act very seriously. We have a suite of compliance and enforcement tools available to us to get the behaviour change that we need, and the tool that we choose will always depend on the facts and the circumstances, but our commitment to the South Australian community is that we will be transparent and consistent and proportionate in our approach. And we have a team of investigators and scientists standing by to make sure that South Australian environmental laws are upheld.
Amy, thank you very much. So look, we'll move on to our Q&A now. So just a reminder, you can submit questions using your Q&A function. So we'll begin with the questions that were submitted in advance before the questions you've asked tonight. And I want to reassure you, no question will go unanswered. So I'd like to introduce you to Dominic Peppicelli, the Principal Engineer from the Department for Environment and Mining, who's going to facilitate our discussion. Welcome, Dom.
Thanks very much for that, Paul, and good evening, everyone. So, as Paul said, I'm here today to go through the Q&A session with everyone, so please do get your questions in. As Paul also said, we also had some questions that were sent in by registered participants before the session, which I would like to go through along with my colleagues. So as you get those questions in, the first one I have here is a question about the water required for the process and where would it come from. So perhaps I'll start and pass on to my colleagues as required. So as of now, there is currently no proposal for hydraulic fracture stimulation in the southeast. So we can't comment yet on where the water source may be. But as Paul mentioned through his presentation, the Environmental Impact Report and Statement of Environmental Objectives, which we call EIR and SEO for short, you'll probably hear that a fair bit today, is the step where the environmental impacts associated with water are addressed, and as part of that, a water source is determined, and the impacts associated with extracting from that water source is then fleshed out throughout the environmental impact report, and then demonstrated in terms of management through the statement of environmental objectives. So we go through that process as part of the ER and SCO, and we bring in our co-regulators as part of assessing the impacts of extracting from that water source. Importantly, that extraction also needs to be in accordance with the water allocation plan for the region. And perhaps I can pass on to Ben to describe a bit more about how water allocation plans work in the region.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, really not too much more to add, really, other than that. I mean, as people will be familiar in the region, there is a range of rules under the water allocation plan in those areas that are fully allocated. That water would need to be sourced by accessing an existing licence, so through trade, so purchasing a licence off someone else. If there is an area, and more broadly, where there was water available, then that would go through the normal assessment process for a water licence. But there is a very robust, rigorous approach to allocating water. But yeah, fully allocated, they need to purchase a licence off someone.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben. So perhaps I'll go on to our second question that was pre-prepared as part of the registrations that came through. So this is around who will be responsible for cleanup of a well if the well proves to be uneconomical, and what remediation requirements would apply. So perhaps this is more in Dem's court to respond to this. So in terms of liability and who's responsible for remediation, this at all times sit with the proponent or the licensee. So this is throughout the life cycle of operations, so and includes everything from seismic to drilling wells to going forward with constructing of pipelines and facilities. So at all stages, the liability associated with those activities, the responsibility of the licensee. So there's obligations that are and requirements that are set out again through that ER and SEO process in terms of the standards that need to be met for decommissioning and rehabilitation. For example, for wells, there's a leading practice industry standards that are used for well decommissioning. Some of the standards we use are out of Norway called the NORSOC standards, and also out of the US API standards. So these standards outline the various requirements around setting plugs and ensuring there's no potential for loss of containment in future for that decommissioned well. There's also, in addition to those standards, there's guidelines for environmental rehabilitation of the land at the surface, and the overarching principle there is to reinstate the land back to its original environment and ecology. So effectively, as if there was no activity in that region. So all of those standards and rehabilitation requirements are all, again, set out in the ER and SEO. And again, those are put through a consultation process where the community, co-regulators and other stakeholders can have their say on those requirements and their thoughts on what the impacts might be associated with that rehabilitation. I'll add a couple more points in terms of our enforcement framework under the Energy Resources Act. So if rehabilitation requirements get to a point where the operator perhaps isn't cooperating or maybe goes insolvent, there's a suite of compliance and enforcement provisions under the Energy Resources Act, and they range from we have what's called a compliance pyramid. So at the base of the pyramid, they range from things such as notice of non-compliances, show causes, and then we can escalate up the pyramid to directions, and then at the top to punitive measures around license cancellation and also escalation to court as well. So we have a range of enforcement measures in the Act. And my last point will be in terms of companies that may trade or go insolvent, we have what's called a financial assurance policy under the Energy Resources Act, which ensures the government holds security over those activities that are undertaken under the Act. And that security is in the form of bank guarantees that are held by the government. But we also hold or we charge what's called well fees, annual well fees on suspended wells to ensure that the amount of suspended wells held by the state is reduced, and we continue to see an effort on rehabilitation throughout the state. So perhaps I'll go to the third question that was provided to us before the session, and that's around what the role of the Local Landscapes Board is under the Energy Resources Act. So perhaps maybe Ben, you can maybe describe the Landscapes Board down there and their role, and maybe I can talk about how they link in under the Energy Resources Act.
Sure.
Yeah.
So those who are familiar with the Limestone Coast Landscape Board, they have a range of responsibilities under the Landscape Act. As I talked about in my presentation, the water affecting activity, I should say, permit is the main one in regards to these activities. But they also are responsible for developing the water allocation plan, which sets the overarching rules for the allocation of water. And they also have a range of other non-water related responsibilities. So things like land management, looking after soil erosion, pest animal weed control, that will affect the broader environment around any sort of development. So they're very much the on-ground local team that manage natural resource managers in the natural resources, I should say, in the region.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben. And in terms of how the Landscape Board connect into the Energy Resources Act and our process, again, and we're going back to the Environmental Impact Report and Statement of Environmental Objectives process again, because I guess that's our one process that brings all stakeholders to the table, and the Landscape Board is one of those stakeholders, and they provide expert advice on the things that Ben mentioned, in particular around water resource management, things like pests and biosecurity, other topics that they provide valuable insight into as part of that process. And as mentioned previously, they also set out the water allocation plans for the region. I'll get through these last two, then we'll get to the questions coming in online. And maybe, Amy, I can bring you into this question also. So this one is around, can we provide more information on the Limestone Coast and its aquifers in relation to this process? And perhaps I'll start on it and bring you in, Amy. So in terms of the aquifer situation in the southeast, we know it's a very unique setting, and there's the two aquifers being the shallow Gambia limestone and then the underlying Dilwyn formation. And we know that these provide, or they're basically a lifeblood for the industry and the community down in the southeast. So as part of characterising the aquifers in the region through the EIR and SEO process, there's a step that we see up front in the EIR where we set out what is the environment that we're dealing with in terms of undertaking the proposed activity. And as part of that, for the aquifer in particular, we go through a process of developing a hydrogeological model. And this is done in accordance with due guidelines and consulted on between DEM and due. And then we also go through setting up on the management side baseline monitoring and ongoing monitoring in line with some of the EPA guidelines. So perhaps, Amy, you can expand on some of those guidelines that we bring in around monitoring.
Sure. So what I could say with confidence is that the environmental values set out in the Water Quality Environment Protection Policy I referred to earlier are absolutely triggered. And that means that every precaution would need to be taken in the SEO, in the EIR, in any environmental licence to make sure that that water was protected.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Amy. as Amy has alluded to, if it shows that groundwater can't be protected, then yeah, we'll not be going forward with approval of that project. So that's the utmost importance for the regulator. And the final question here is around concerns about health and also mental health impacts in the community and community opposition in the region. And we understand that this is a very contentious issue. And as Paul mentioned, what's being proposed is not an approval for fracture stimulation, where it's merely enabling the assessment of the potential for looking at the impacts and doing your baseline environmental studies. And as part of that process, as we said, there's a community consultation aspect to it. And what I'll mention is, in terms of the environmental impact report, the definition of environment in the Act is a broad definition. So it doesn't just include the natural environment, but it also includes the economic environment, the cultural environment, and also the social environment. So that includes impacts to the community and their well-being. So those need to also be addressed as part of that process. And they are real impacts that we need to see addressed and managed accordingly. And as I mentioned, that will be done in consultation with our co-regulators and the community. So perhaps I'll move to some of the online questions here. So forgive me as I run through a few of them. So one of the questions here is who decides whether stakeholder concerns have been adequately addressed? Maybe Paul, did you want to maybe come in to answer that one?
Look, so what I would say is, as stakeholder concerns come through the regulatory process, the department provides an independent view on whether or not those concerns have been addressed. And I can tell you, frequently we go back to proponents and say you need to do more. We also consult with our co-regulators, but ultimately the department, as coordinating as an independent regulator, will make that assessment.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. Okay. So another question here is, who runs the 30-day consultation with relevant stakeholders, and what methodology is used for distribution? So that 30-day consultation is run by the government and by the Department for Energy and Mining. So in terms of the methodology for distribution, there's several methods of distribution. So not only is it advertised through local papers, there's also it goes through what we call the Your Say website, which it then outreaches to those who have registered at that site. We also publish online on the various media platforms, and that is a 30 business day process as well. So it's effectively a 6-week process where we look to get all of that the community feedback as part of that process. Okay. Maybe another one, maybe for you, Paul. So the federal Labor government have recently announced a gas reservation policy. However, you keep using the language around the East Coast is running out of gas. So can you elaborate more on why we're doing this in the light of those federal policies?
Yeah, thank you. So the federal government has been undertaking a process of examining how much gas is needed for the domestic market versus how much is exported to our key trading partners in North Asia. And this takes place exclusively from the port of Gladstone in Queensland, where gas is exported as liquefied natural gas. Now, that gas is, as I say, sourced from Queensland, and that takes a significant. Australia is one of the world's largest LNG exporters. That's been a source of significant wealth for the country. It's also in recent weeks, as many of you will be aware, it's been quite important to our LNG exports in securing fuel supplies coming in to this country from our trading partners. So the federal government is keen to ensure that there is sufficient gas available for the domestic market and trying to balance the needs of the export market with the domestic market. What I would say is any gas that's developed in the southeast of South Australia would be for the domestic market only. It's not for export, so it would be for use in South Australia. We're quite fortunate there is a pipeline nearby. There is a gas processing facility at Katnook, which is currently mothballed, but that gas would be for domestic use, so domestic manufacturing, gas-fired generation in South Australia, etc. That doesn't take away from the overall problems of the East Coast gas market. We have seen a decline in gas exploration in both New South Wales and Victoria, which has led to a tightening of the gas market. And as I said, the energy market operator has forecast that for leading into 2030, unless we take other steps, we do face potential shortfalls, which could end up in higher prices for gas domestically, with impacts on manufacturers and impacts on electricity prices. The reservation policy that the Commonwealth has proposed is complex, so I can't go through it all tonight. But what it seeks to do is require exporting gas companies to ensure that they provide a proportion of the total amount that they're exporting to the domestic market. I hope that helps answer your question.
Great, thank you, Paul. So I had another question here regarding the compounds that are injected to induce the fracturing. So I can touch on this quickly in terms of the general compounds that are injected. So the vast majority of the fluid that's injected downhole is water. So the water is used effectively to pressurize downhole the formation to induce the fractures downhole in those formations. So in addition to the water, there's a small percentage of sand, or what we call proppant, that's included in that fracture stimulation fluid. And that sand is then, the main purpose of the sand is to hold those fractures open in the subsurface to allow the gas or oil to flow back up the well. And then the last component is a small additive component where things are added such as friction reducers and biocides to ensure that there's no friction loss, so you can inject smoothly and there's no build up of things like scale and things like that. So they're the main constituents that are added. But again, given there's no proposal for the southeast, and we're not yet familiar with any fracture stimulation design for the southeast, it would need to go through that environmental assessment process, and we'll assess all the proposed constituents of that fracture stimulation fluid as part of the environmental impact assessment. So I'll go through a few more of these questions. So I have one here maybe on our interaction between DEM and DEW and also the EPA in terms of having requirements under the Department for Energy and Mining, having requirements under the Department for Environment and Water and the Department and the EPA, and how we manage that. And I guess one of the tools we use, and it's publicly facing, is the administrative arrangements that we have in place. So perhaps maybe Ben and Amy can maybe elaborate on those arrangements that we have between the departments.
Thanks, Tom. I guess it's a collaborative approach with DEM taking the lead. We're consulted throughout, so we have arrangements with DEM. They will forward us information to do an independent assessment on, and then we'll provide advice back to the department on that. So done separately, and then we provide the advice back to them. Amy?
Yes, so the administrative arrangement makes it really clear that the EPA provides advice and commentary in relation to all exploration activities as well as production activities. So in the absence of that administrative arrangement, that probably would not occur. What the administrative arrangement also does is it makes the process for approvals more streamlined, because there is a separate environmental approval. We need to make sure that government is understands what advice it's giving to industry when it assesses and approves development.
Yeah, and we also have those administrative arrangements in place with other organisations such as SafeWork as well. So we work with all our co-regulators in the state. So one of the questions here is regarding the consultation period, and to what extent does the proponent need to take into account the community sentiment and the lack of social license. So I guess, as I said previously, the environmental impact report and statement of environmental objectives, that process needs to go through looking at impacts to all aspects of the environment, which includes the social impact side of things. In terms of community sentiment, and it's not only the impacts that will be looked at. If there are any benefits that can be provided to the industry, that would also be part of the process. So, and that's not just benefits to the underlying landowners, which include compensation requirements as well, but also benefits to the wider community as well. And we have seen some of that as part of the previous drilling and gas operations that have occurred in the region. So yeah, as I said, that process will likely go through those benefits and those concerns from the community. Okay, maybe a question here on the federal, any impact on federal processes regarding any proposals for fracture stimulation, and in the case of the federal legislation that would apply, it would be the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, so the EPBC Act, and that does play a role in assessing unconventional gas projects as well as large coal mining, and if this is proposed in the region, the federal government will have a role in assessing that through the EPBC provisions, if they trigger those provisions, and as part of that, there's also what's called the Independent Expert Scientific Committee under the federal government, which is an independent committee that provides advice to the process under the EPBC. So that's potentially a process, or likely a process, that will be triggered as part of this if it does go ahead. Maybe Ben, you could perhaps provide some light on that ISC process, as I know you are involved in administering some of that on behalf of the state.
Yeah, sure. So the independent committee was set up a number of years ago, must be over a decade ago, I think, and it's set up to get the key experts from around Australia to assess these types of applications. So it's really in response to a lot of the coal seam gas exploration in Queensland and New South Wales, and so that committee's been brought together to provide independent advice to the Commonwealth Government. That's removed from any agency process. But certainly the scientists involved in that are of international renown. So that gives us some confidence when that referral is used that we're getting the best possible scientific advice, in addition to the really high quality scientific advice that we have within our own organisations.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Perhaps we have time for one or two more. Feel free to jump in, guys, if there's one that catches your eye. But so I have one here regarding some of the community engagement that's already taken place in the southeast on this topic, and some more details around when it happened and who was it with. So I guess the initial engagement on this proposal began with the country cabinet that Paul Martyn attended with the Premier and various ministers as part of their annual visit to the region, and post that event, we also had drop-in sessions at Mount Gambier and Naracoorte last week, where the regulators, so myself and members of the team here at DEM, also held information sessions and with the public, and we had some good conversations on what our process is under the regulations under the Energy Resources Act, if a proposal was to come through. Beyond that, we do have plans for further engagement in the southeast towards going through this year, and I guess it will be dependent on some of the outcomes in Parliament also. Was there anything else you wanted to maybe add to that?
Talk about some Tom's work?
Yes, so we've also had, in terms of the work on the minerals side, so the Department for Energy and Mining covers not only energy resources, oil and gas, but also mining, mineral extraction. And there's been a lot of work that has been occurring in the region as part of DEM's social engagement with the community through Tom Sweeney, who's a member of the team here, who's almost a regular down in the southeast now. And he's been engaging to understand what are some of the concerns on the mining side of things in the southeast, and really hearing from the community to understand how we can address those concerns. And they not only would apply to mining, but a lot of those concerns also apply to the energy resources side as well, in terms of protecting key receptors, again, water being the key one there, and also the economies down in the southeast and the community well-being as well. So work continues to occur in the southeast in terms of understanding those impacts and potential benefits as well as part of that. And we'll still be including that work as part of our engagement plans going forward in 2026. It's probably time to wrap up now. So thanks for those who sent the questions in. As Paul said, any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us using that email link, which is provided there. And yes, I'll thank you for your time, and I'll pass you over to Paul to close.
Dominic, thank you. And look, I do want to say thank you to everyone who has taken time out of your busy lives to attend this session tonight. The fact that you've done so means that you're obviously very involved in the community and interested in what happens in the region. I hope that tonight's session has given you a good sense of the regulatory assessment process that is undertaken and the roles of the various agencies and the kinds of considerations that are brought to bear. As I'd just like to say thank you to Amy, thank you to Ben, and thank you to Dom. And we look forward to continue to engage in the southeast no matter what happens through the parliamentary process. All of our agencies are engaged in the region, and it is an important part of the state. So thank you, everyone. If you've asked a question we haven't got back to you, we will get back to you very quickly. But again, thank you for your time.